Nigel Topping, who's the UK's high-level champion for climate action at COP26. The champion role was, by the way, created in 2015 at the climate talks in Paris to try to help realise ambitions to lower carbon emissions and build resilience to climate change. Nigel Topping, welcome. There are still very clearly sticking points in the draft conclusions document. What is yet to be agreed?
Well, I mean, as we've heard, it could just be down to a few words. I mean, the sticking points are always the degree of between encourages, urges, requests, or requires. The sort of what the verb is. For example, on upping ambition. I mean, there's strong expectations, I think, from both civil society and business that countries who haven't yet delivered a second plan, as required by Paris, should do so as soon as possible. And also, given the dynamism of the changes that we're seeing in the real economy, that plans should generally be revised more often. International finance for adaptation is also a big issue, and the confidence that the 100 billion that was promised and hasn't yet been delivered will be delivered maybe as soon as next year. And then some of the language and the strength of the language around the phasing out of coal and the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. Again, you can imagine that those are quite contentious issues between different countries depending on how much they rely on income from those commodities. The one thing I would say is that what we haven't heard about is the fact that there's also been an awful lot of momentum from the organisations that I'm required to work with through my UN role, and that's non-state actors, cities, states and regions, businesses and investors. And we've seen more commitment and energy to short-term action from them than ever before. So I'm hoping that that will encourage countries to be a bit bolder in these last 2 hours or 2 days, as we'll see.
For outside observers, it's very difficult to get a clear take on what's going on beyond the spin. The United Nations Secretary-General saying efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees are on life support, in his words. In your judgment, what has realistically been achieved over the last 2 weeks?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, if you look at the trajectory, before Paris, we were on track to more like a 6-degree temperature rise. After Paris, maybe just below 4 degrees. Coming into Glasgow, 2.7. That's continued to nudge down. The analysis suggests it's somewhere between 1.8 and 2.4 if everything that's been pledged is implemented. So still not 1.5. So I think the Secretary-General is right to say that 1.5 degrees is on life support. But as I say, what's been achieved here? A lot more momentum in the real economy, a massive wave of commitments from the private finance sector to align their portfolios and balance sheets with 1.5 degrees. And real progress in the negotiating text in terms of the sense of dynamism required, and even including language on fossil fuel abatement, or removal of coal from the power grid and removal of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. It's quite a significant step forward, I think.
Our correspondent, Nigel, not far from you, was suggesting a possibility of talks extending into the weekend. What are you hearing? Is there any point in extending? Is there still more to be agreed and talked about?
Well, until there's consensus, there's a point in extending, because if there's no consensus, then there's no agreement, and you don't want people to walk away from here without an agreement. The other thing which we didn't really talk about is some of the detailed technical negotiations on what we call the Paris rule book, rules about how often and how countries report their emissions reductions. Technical, but again really important, because if we don't agree on the mechanisms for transparency and keeping track, then how can we all trust each other? So that's also looking hopeful to be resolved. As to whether it's 2 hours or 2 days, I'd be very doubtful if it's 2 hours, because there's just a track record of running. It's almost like an unwritten rule of negotiations. You've got to go to the wire and then a little bit longer. If it is landed today, that'd be a real coup for the UK presidency, but more likely I think it'll be tomorrow.
And it's a very rarefied atmosphere inside that ring of steel among those world leaders. I wonder, as you cross in through security every morning to attend that conference, do you get the sense that those politicians are behind the people, in particular young people, when it comes to momentum on climate change?
Well, I think you'd have to say on an overall assessment would be no, that the very loud and I mean, calls filled with pain, frustration, anger from young people and broader civil society are not being met by the level of ambition we see in the negotiations. Of course, they're not the only people that politicians have to work with. They're trying to balance all the voices back home. But I think that those loud voices are upping the pressure and we are seeing more ambition as a result of that. It's just, getting 196 countries to agree on every comma is a very high bar for consensus. So my sense is we'll see another ratchet in ambition. We won't be on track to 1.5, but hopefully we'll see the dynamism in the real economy being reflected now in a more frequent requirement to update plans so that we do get on track to 1.5 within the next 2 or 3 years.
Nigel Topping at COP26 in Glasgow, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.